Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the launch of the Armed Conflict Survey 2016, which provides data and analysis of the military, political, and humanitarian dimensions of the world's armed conflicts. As you will have seen from the book, it includes maps, infographics, and our highly regarded chart of conflict to illustrate key trends, as well as thematic essays by some of the world's leading experts on conflict. This is the second edition of the Armed Conflict Survey, drawing on data from the IISS Armed Conflict Database, which monitors the world's active armed conflicts on a daily basis and is gaining increasing attention from governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, and international organizations. The essays in this year's Armed Conflict Survey are on pessimism and planning in armed conflict, the political economy of violent conflict, the threat from foreign fighters, and the changing role of female combatants. It's a real pleasure to have with us Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, author of the opening essay, who I'll invite to the podium in just a second. Also on the panel are Dr. Anastasia Voronkova, editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, Virginia Commerly, Research Fellow for Security and Development and one of the UK's leading experts on Boko Haram, Hebatala Taha, Research Analyst at the IISS Middle East Office in Bahrain, and Jens Wardener, Research Analyst for Armed Conflict. But first I'd like to ask Professor Freedman, author of the alliteratively entitled Planning and Pessimism on Armed Conflict essay, to speak first. Laurie.
John, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be associated with this volume, which is really extremely useful and very well put together. The opening essay that I provided was really a reflection on whether or not, after a period in which pessimism seemed to encompass attitudes towards the use of armed force in the West, captured in some ways very clearly by President Obama's recent interview in the Atlantic Monthly, whether that assumption that whatever we do, it's bound to go wrong, and by way of contrast with the optimism about the use of armed force that one found in the 1990s after Desert Storm, whether that may just be turning not necessarily because of a newfound enthusiasm for the use of force or even greater confidence in how it could be used, but just out of sheer necessity, that actually, even if armed force has its limits, and we become all too aware of that, within those limits, maybe there are still things that need to be done. And again, going back to the contrast with the 1990s, when the talk was all of a revolution in military affairs and high precision, high pace warfare against quotes unquote peer competitors, what is striking is that's not the wars we're fighting. The technologies developed for those sort of wars are being applied in quite different contingencies of counterinsurgency and now counter-terrorism. The UAVs, which were going to give a great sense of the battle space, are now being used to pick out particularly evil terrorists and their leaders in order to shoot them down for targeted assassinations. Now, within all of that, it is therefore important to keep on reminding ourselves that one of the things that we're still not that worried about, although perhaps we've become a bit more worried about over the last 2 years than before, is major war. I mean, that's what the revolution in military affairs was geared to, and that is still the greatest potential threat to our security. And it remains noticeable that despite all the talk about Putin's strategic brilliance and aggressive intent, actually he's still been cautious in terms of taking on NATO. He's taken on Georgia and Ukraine, neither of which are members of NATO. And even in the case of Ukraine, despite what we were told Russian forces were capable of, in the end, it's been awful for Ukraine, but still quite limited. And the response from the West has been to sit up and think, well, actually, maybe we still do have a problem. Maybe still we do need deterrence. Maybe we still need to think about the security of member states bordering Russia. So there's been quite a strong response to that. With China, I think it's more complex and difficult, but you have still the same sense of probing, seeing how far you can go, checking back, checking forward, according to the Western response. But we're still a long way away from, as one would see quite a bit, even at the start of 2014, when the terrible tendency to make analogies with past wars was in full flight, looking back to 1914, were we in a 1914 situation with China? No, we weren't, and we're unlikely to be. So if it happens, it'll be very different to 1914. What's drawn us back into actual use of force is therefore not the big and most dangerous contingencies, but one that is nonetheless very perplexing and frightening, which is the rise of ISIL and the response to the Syrian civil war. What we've realized, which is not news, is that you can't contain these conflicts. That once certain groups get established in certain ways, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep on moving, probing, trying, and will be emulated. So we've had, in the last year, in 2015, two major crises. One, which is the most substantial and very much ongoing, the refugee crisis, with hundreds of thousands of people, millions, trying to escape from these conflict zones. And where do they try to escape to? The most prosperous landmass close at hand. And terrorism, which has been afflicting Iraq and Syria and other parts of the Middle East for some time, but occasionally and very dramatically makes its appearance, as it did at the end of the year, in Europe. And this has prompted Western countries to start to think about how it is that they can, and if at all, they can turn things around. Now, what one comes to as soon as one looks at the problem is that the actual ability to apply armed force is really only one part of the problem, and possibly even quite a small part. The real problem is just sorting out the politics of what it is you're trying to do and who it is you're trying to support. And the real problem of the Middle East at the moment is that if you pursue one set of objectives, you're probably likely to make another set of objectives much harder to achieve. The cross-cutting antagonisms, rivalries, temporary alliances, alignments in the region make it very hard to be able to act with a sure touch. And this just doesn't go for the Western countries or even Russia. It's true for the countries of the Middle East as well. It's just a very difficult place to get your politics right, and by and large, everybody fails. And so if you look at what, trying to work one's way through the Syrian civil war, as Lavrov and Kerry are trying to do at the moment, what one soon comes up against is not just the obvious problems of what does one do with Assad, how does one get everybody else to focus on ISIL, but, for example, to take Turkey's position, the Kurds seem a pretty good ally against ISIL, but they seem to be very threatening by Turkey. Turkey, if one would, looking back to 2014, one would have said Turkey was emerging as quite a natural local ally of Russia, and then all of a sudden they're at loggerheads, and the risks of a NATO-Russia clash come at a completely unexpected place. It's very difficult to get it right. So what does that tell us then about the future of the Western responses, if you like, to the sort of conflicts that we're seeing? President Obama described the objectives against ISIL as to degrade and ultimately destroy. but degrade seems the more operative word, for good reason, is that you're dealing with a phenomenon that you're not going to destroy. You're going to destroy it as well as Israel's destroyed Hamas. It's rooted too much in local populations and local communities. Even if the names change, and ISIL is an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, even if the names change, well, we've had this now for too many decades of an austere form of Islam turned into a political movement, very hostile to the West, but also hostile to all communities that don't share this sort of faith. It's not going to go away. It's not going to be eliminated, but it can be denied the basis and the sense of a state that was its main claim to innovation and challenge in 2013, and well, it still has its redoubts in Raqqa and Mosul. Let me conclude then in terms of what I think this tells us about the approach. If you go back again to the 1990s, we were still working with models of the decisive use of armed force, decisive victories, triumphs, defeats of the opponents, elimination, overwhelming power, and even to President Bush's bring it on as the insurgency grew in Iraq. We're now talking about something very different. It's hedging, it's containing, it's conditionality, it's keeping things in reserve, it's managing, it's tentative. It's about establishing a position, but it's a floor, not a ceiling, where there is far less confidence, and that is right. There should be far less confidence in the use of armed force because the limits are profound. But what I think did start to happen during the last year and a half is that a greater awareness that within those limits there are things that you may still have to do. And that if you can establish a position, then the options are there, if necessary, to do much more. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Laurie, thank you very much for that survey, and let me again recommend the full essay in today's book for careful review. I'd like to take 10 or 15 minutes then to highlight some of the detailed assessments we make in this year's armed conflict database and survey. And we begin by really concluding that 2015 was the year that, for better or for worse, the state struck back in many of the world's largest armed conflicts, making territorial gains in the face of considerable resistance. In Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen, government forces recaptured land previously held by rebel groups. Often this was achieved with the help of foreign allies. The introduction of Russian air power enabled the Syrian government to go onto the offensive and to recover 10,000 square kilometers of land, including towns in the south and east of Aleppo, the town of Karatian in Homs province, and strategically important parts of Dara, Latakia, and Hama provinces. The US-led coalition increased the tempo of its airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, while on the ground Iranian forces supported government offensives, including the recapture of Tikrit. In Nigeria, the army announced it had recovered all of the towns it lost to Boko Haram in 2014. In its fightback, it was supported by the African Union's multinational joint task force, to which Chad, Cameroon, Niger, and Benin contributed troops. In Somalia, the National Army and the African Union force AMISOM conducted successful offensives against al-Shabaab strongholds in the south. They also recaptured several towns and villages in the provinces of Gedo, Bakul, and Bay. Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies conducted airstrikes in Yemen and later inserted advisors, trainers, and ultimately their own troops to help President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi recover Aden and 4 other provinces from the Houthis. Amid this trend of rising intervention, we note a distinct reversion to more classical forms of statecraft, with power being projected to secure national interests. Whereas previously this was largely the preserve of the P5 states, it is now being pursued with alacrity and determination by regional powers. Egypt and Turkey also upped the ante in their fight against insurgent groups, but without scoring any notable territorial gains. Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, strengthened his grip on power and pursued a tougher approach to insurgents in the Sinai, where the army practiced a scorched earth policy, and other parts of the country. In Turkey, the government responded to increased security threats with greater military force, bombing PKK camps in neighboring states and seeking to wrest control of southeastern cities from insurgents. The armed conflict database shows that fatalities in Turkey in 2015 were at the highest level in 15 years, taking the country back to a level of violence last seen before the capture of Abdullah Öcalan. In the previous edition of the Armed Conflict Survey, we noted that since 2008, there had been a decrease in the number of active conflicts, but a steady increase in fatalities. In 2015, the death toll halted its rapid ascent, while all major active conflicts persisted. Globally, we assess conflict fatalities amounted to 167,000. Half of those deaths occurred in conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, and a further 21% in Latin America. In those regions, fatalities remain stubbornly high, and there are few signs of conflicts moving towards de-escalation or resolution. On our conservative count, the death toll in Syria fell in 2015 to 55,000, yet this accounted for 1/3 of conflict fatalities globally. Conflict deaths rose sharply in Turkey, Egypt, and Yemen to 2,000, 3,000, and 7,500 respectively. We judge that the prospects for resolution or de-escalation grew more distant in those three conflicts and certainly drew no closer in Iraq, the Palestinian territories, or Lebanon. Syria's ceasefire has kindled some hope of a political solution, as have the attritional effects of 4 years of fighting on the disposition of forces there, but we remain doubtful the civil war will be resolved in the near term. Nearly all of Latin America's fatalities took place in Mexico and the Central American triangle of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, where combined conflict deaths rose to 34,000 from 30,000 in 2014. Fatalities in these conflicts are actually on a par with Iraq, even though none of the fighting is conducted with heavy weaponry. The one bright spot for Latin America was the gathering momentum of Colombia's peace negotiations and the sharp decline in FARC attacks in the second half of 2015, which helped to push annual fatalities down to 350 from 500 a year earlier and 1,000 in 2013. Afghanistan's conflict registered the largest rise in conflict fatalities to 15,000. 2 years earlier, the figure was just 3,500, underlining the decline in security since ISAF began its drawdown in earnest. Fatalities also rose markedly in Nigeria's battle with Boko Haram, reaching 11,000 compared to 7,000 in 2014. 6 conflicts: Syria, Iraq, Mexico, Central America, Afghanistan, and Nigeria accounted for nearly 4/5, 80%, of global conflict fatalities. Elsewhere, perhaps developments are a bit more encouraging. The dominant trend in active conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia is towards de-escalation or resolution. In our judgment, the prospects for conflict resolution in Mali, the Central African Republic, and Somalia improved during the course of 2015. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, they became no worse. We calculate the death toll in sub-Saharan Africa's conflicts fell to 24,000 from 30,000 a year earlier, notwithstanding the rise in fatalities in Nigeria. Developments in India and Southeast Asia also inspire some optimism. The conflicts in Myanmar, southern Thailand, the Philippines, and India's Nagaland moved closer to resolution in 2015. Few of the region's other conflicts became appreciably worse, and fatalities in Southeast Asia plus India barely exceeded 2,000. In the battle against ISIS across the Middle East and North Africa, we've seen a displacement effect. As the group lost territory in Syria and Iraq, it sought to bolster its presence in Libya. Developments there underline the challenges facing the group beyond its home region, but also its resilience. Islamic State seized control of the eastern city of Derna only to be ejected by citizens revolted by the group's brutality. This was nearly repeated in Sirte, the city which the group now aspires to establish as a so-called second Raqqa, as locals rose up against the Islamic State. ISIS faces a challenge in Libya. Its fighters there are seen as outsiders, and society lacks the sectarian divisions on which the jihadists have fed in Iraq and Syria. Yet the group's success in reinforcing Sirte and so holding the city testifies to its determination and resources. It will not be ejected swiftly or easily. Progress towards peace talks between Libya's rival governments was partly a consequence of rising international concern over ISIS. This is not the only example of the catalyzing effect that the Islamic State has had on international cooperation. Concern at the threat emanating from Syria prompted renewed efforts by the US and Russia to broker a ceasefire and launch peace talks. Elsewhere in the world, the rise of ISIS has inspired cooperation between unlikely partners. Israel and Hamas have tacitly worked together to keep the group out of the Gaza Strip, and Russia has shared intelligence with the Taliban to stop the Islamic State advancing in Afghanistan. Although there are fewer armed conflicts today than a decade ago, the number of refugees and internally displaced people has surged from 33 million in 2013 to 43 million in 2014 and 46 million by mid-2015. Alongside this quantum leap in forced displacement, the distribution of refugees and IDPs has changed in just a few years. Whereas in the past they were mainly housed in rural camps, today most reside in towns and cities. As the chart of conflict notes, around 80% of refugees in Turkey and Jordan reside in cities. Globally, there are 2 IDPs for every refugee. Often, IDPs face greater risk to their security and well-being than do refugees. They also tend to be displaced for longer. The average duration for an IDP is 23 years versus a still important 17 years for a refugee. Displacement on this scale is a humanitarian, political, and economic disaster for states in conflict and for many of their neighbors. It presents huge obstacles to stabilization, conflict resolution, reconstruction. And as the previous edition of the Armed Conflict Survey noted, a solution to preventing forced displacement has 3 elements. Firstly, the application of effective pressure on conflict parties to abide by the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. That will limit the scale of initial displacement and facilitate the return of displaced people. Secondly, securing better access for humanitarian relief in the country of conflict. That way, civilians will not be forced to flee simply to secure access to food, water, and shelter. Thirdly, and most importantly, greater political action to de-escalate and resolve conflicts. If states are to embrace this challenge, of course, they will have to expend more political and economic resources and devote a greater proportion of them to tackling the drivers of conflict rather than, of course, simply treating their symptoms. Alongside a growing influx of refugees, Europe has also in the past year experienced terrorist attacks in which EU nationals who fought in Syria and Iraq played a leading role. Daniel Byman, writing an essay in this year's Armed Conflict Survey, notes that the post-2010 conflicts in Syria and Iraq have attracted more foreign fighters than even the anti-Soviet resistance in Afghanistan, which spawned al-Qaeda. Not all such conflicts exhibit bleed-out, in which foreign fighters return home and then attack their fellow citizens. Of the 30,000 foreigners in the ranks of Islamic State, we assess that approximately 5,000 are Westerners. Of these, 1/5 or more are likely actually to die in combat. Others will remain abroad to avoid arrest. Some will return home war-weary or deterred from engaging in violence by the risk of endangering friends and family. This leaves a core of returnees, battle-hardened and indoctrinated, that pose a threat to their home states. A measure of insecurity is an inescapable cost of living, of course, in a liberal society. Western security services now are larger, better informed, and better funded than they were before 9/11, but they cannot thwart every plot. Smarter management of bleed-out can help, but the threat will remain while the conflicts remain active. And so for policymakers, wrestling with the challenge of bringing conflicts to an end, we hope that this armed conflict survey and the database on which it draws constitute principal sources of data and analysis. My colleagues are delighted to take any specific questions you might have on any of the countries or the regions we cover in this year's survey. Yes. You could just wait for the microphone 1 second and give us your name and affiliation.
Ewan McCaskill from The Guardian.
Yep.
Picking up Professor Freedman's point in relation to Libya, is that an intervention to be optimistic about the prospect of an Italian-led force with a large British contingent?
Could I ask Brigadier Ben Barry to take that?
Ewan, thanks for the question. Libya is another example of an extremely complicated conflict, and I'd commend to all of you the excellent analysis of the last year in the conflict, which is in page 99 of the book. As John said, there's been enough international consensus for the weight of the international community to fall behind the government of national accord and its prime minister. And in addition, there's clearly a cultural gap between ISIS and many of the Libyan people, and there's not the sectarian opportunities that ISIS has exploited in Syria and Iraq. So it would seem to me that what is clearly some sort of US-led special forces activity and the occasional airstrike is likely to continue against ISIS. But also the international coalition, if you like, which has got behind the government of national accord and is looking to support it, but without making things worse. That seems to me to be a perfectly sensible way for the international community to attempt to alter the balance within Libya, but in a way that isn't going to lead to further problems.
Ben, thanks very much. Yes, please.
Thank you. Ali Bahaji of North-South Publications. There is a lot of saber rattling in Southeast China Sea with the neighboring countries there, and of course against China. And America is actually playing a vital role in there. What are the prospects of a war in the area? Thank you.
Yeah, we're very happy to answer that question. I should just underscore, of course, that the South China Sea is not covered in the Armed Conflict Survey because the Armed Conflict Survey covers internal conflicts. We do touch on some of the countries in the region like Thailand, but the actual challenges in the South China Sea we of course cover in Strategic Survey and the Military Balance and in various books and essays we write. But it's a good question, so can I just invite Nick Childs to address what the containment challenges there are?
Thank you. Yes, in terms of the South China Sea, as Laurie Freedman mentioned, this perhaps is in the context of, as he put it, the probing that's going on and the conflicting challenges of a rising power and an established power. We are potentially reaching some form of inflection point with a number of events that are approaching, including the decisions and the arbitration judgments of the panel looking into the Philippines versus China cases in terms of the maritime disputes, particularly around the Scarborough Shoals. We've also got the fact that the Americans have been talking about at least detecting some preparatory activity to further work by China, perhaps around the Scarborough Shoals around that time, in the context of everything that's been going on with the land reclamation that has been so controversial since last year. As a result, we do have a sense in which there is an important sort of action-reaction dynamic underway, with particularly the resumption of freedom of navigation operations. At the moment, it looks to be a containable situation, albeit against a context of tensions. The freedom of navigation operations have also been accompanied by other high-profile naval activities by the United States in response to the Chinese activities, not least the deployment of a carrier strike group to the South China Sea, and the high-profile visit of the US Defense Secretary Carter at that time, the new relationship now established thanks to clearing through the courts between the United States and the Philippines, so more activity there. And for the moment, it looks to be a case that this remains a potentially tense action-reaction dynamic, but in the context, I think, of concerns about escalation, so potentially it remains containable, but with worries about miscalculation on either side in the context of lots of political transitions, not least that in the United States, and some pressure from within the United States from the likes of Senator John McCain for the Obama administration to show a little bit more of an aggressive and committed response to the Chinese. But underlying it all, one gets a sense that this remains a containable issue for the moment, albeit one to watch.
Yes, please.
Jonathan Beale from BBC. I think one of the more shocking figures there is the Afghanistan figure, largest year-on-year increase with 15,000 deaths. And I'm trying to work out whether this is purely related to the drawdown, as you seem to be suggesting, and if there is, given that the assurances the politicians made when the drawdown happened that Afghanistan was in a much better place, whether there is any cause for optimism at all that this might be reversed.
Jens Wardner?
Yes, I think largely this rather alarming increase in fatalities in Afghanistan is due to the Western drawdown of forces. We have seen that it's emboldened the Taliban to really go on a strong offensive throughout the country and throughout almost the entire year, not just in their southern heartlands, but also in the north in Kunduz, where they famously took captured a provincial capital for the first time, if only briefly. Looking ahead to 2016, I think we'll see more of the same. Provincial capitals will remain at risk from falling to the Taliban. The government is split, and indeed Nicholas Haysom, the UNAMA head, told the Security Council in March that the unity government, or for the unity government, survival will be an achievement in 2016.
Ben, do you want to add anything?
I think the evidence is that NATO, throughout the last 5 years or so, fought with quite a lot of restraint, quite prescriptive rules of engagement that limited the use of their firepower. I think the evidence suggests that the Afghan forces, bearing in mind they have far less NATO air support, are fighting with less restraint and are using firepower more liberally. And that, together with the increased Taliban activity that Jens has described, is probably one of the significant contributors to the increase in civilian deaths, and are not optimistic that that particular factor is going to reduce over this coming fighting season.
Thank you. Yes?
Larissa Brown from the Daily Mail. Just two questions on Afghanistan. I'm wondering how concerned we should be about the Islamic State presence there, and could this figure rise over the next few months and years? And also, just the British government have said that Afghanistan is safe enough to deport Afghan interpreters back to the country, and I'm just wondering, given the rise in the death statistics, is this true? Thank you.
We'll have Jens first and then Ben again. Jens?
Yes. ISIS in Afghanistan, or Khorasan province, as the affiliate is called, really started last year in January when they were approved as an official affiliate by the central ISIS leadership. They came in at a very opportune time for them. At the time, just after the drawdown of Western forces, and at the middle of the year, we will also see a split in the Taliban because of the revelation of the death of Mullah Omar. And ISIS then managed to gain the allegiance of several other armed groups within Afghanistan, such as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. However, the Taliban was not very happy with ISIS' entrance in Afghanistan, as they see themselves as the sole leaders of jihad in Afghanistan. And so what we've actually seen is ISIS, who have their stronghold in Nangarhar province in the east, actually fighting the Taliban. And the government, Afghan government, actually let that go on for quite a while before they began attacking ISIS in Afghanistan. And then we also see now a really large increase in US airstrikes on ISIS. And so we've actually seen now ISIS probably losing territory in eastern Afghanistan due to these factors, and probably also the leadership has fled Nangarhar province up to Kunar or Nuristan further north.
Ben?
Rather unremarked by the media, over the winter, the United States extended the remit of its counter-terrorism task force in Afghanistan from al-Qaeda to include ISIS. And in the early months of this year, there was something like between 60 and 80 US air and drone strikes on ISIS in and around Nangarhar province. And that has contributed to its containment. The current US estimate is there's about anything between 1,000 and 3,000 ISIS fighters in Afghanistan. The other thing is that at the beginning of last month, the Afghan forces began a preemptive counteroffensive in 3 provinces, in Helmand and Kunduz against the Taliban, but also in Nangarhar against ISIS. As to former Afghan interpreters who don't want to return to their country, I'd say the piece of evidence that bears on this is a significant proportion of the refugees and migrants that arrive in Europe from the east are Afghans, and there's figures that at times this has been as much as 25% of this flow of people.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back, please.
Thank you very much, Khalid al-Mubarak, Sudanese Embassy. About the situation in Darfur, it's not comparable to the situation in 2004 or 2003. There is a great deal of improvement. For example, the Darfur administrative referendum was not the only provision of the Doha document for peace in Darfur which was implemented. Others were implemented. For example, there are now hundreds of reconstruction projects. The national dialogue has seen many rebels return. Some of the remnants of the rebels have now relocated to South Sudan and to Libya. And the diplomatically, the African Union mediation has put forward a formula for peace in the Sudan, which was signed by the government of the Sudan on the 21st of March, and the rebels, so now, the remnants of the rebels, so now, until now have not signed. So there is improvement diplomatically and on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And your question is whether we agree. So, Virginia Commonly?
Yes, thank you. Yes, we largely agree, although we acknowledge that the situation remains quite complex. Especially if you look at the first few months of 2016, we've seen a number of incidents, actually an increase in incidents in Darfur during the first quarter of 2016. Another interesting development that I'd like to highlight here is the number of reports indicating that Sudanese rebels had been found in Libya and had been killed there. So I think that's also something to be borne in mind. So yes, some mild progress, but I would remain cautious.
Thank you. Yeah, no, just behind. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. James Roberts from the Tablet. I think this is probably for Ipatala Taha. Do I detect an endorsement of what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen?
Sorry?
Whether we endorse what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen.
We as the ISS?
Yes, I think that is...
Well, the SEIS are an independent think tank, so we don't really take positions on...
No, I appreciate that.
I mean, there has been quite a bit of concern over the humanitarian aspects of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. The number of civilian deaths in itself is shocking. There's been attacks on infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools. I mean, I'm sure you've seen there's been airstrikes that have killed hundreds of people in one airstrike. So it's obviously not something that we would endorse, but I think there's also been attacks by the other side, by Houthis, that are a lot less mentioned in the media, that have also targeted civilian infrastructure, and that should not also be overlooked from the story of kind of the humanitarian reconciliation that should ensue.
I think we have some very carefully crafted language on this subject between pages 137 and 138, which you're welcome to quote. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi, I'm Micah Luxon from BBC News, and I'm glad to hear that you covered Darfur, because a few weeks ago when they were having the referendum, a lot of the media was covering or was quoting numbers from 2008 when the UN put out the numbers, and it was really hard to find more recent statistics on that, and I was told it was just because it's been very hard to get in there and make an accurate tally. And I was wondering, how do you accurately tell how many fatalities there are in these different conflicts, and especially when governments say you can't come in?
Yeah, thank you very much. No, we've worked very carefully on this question of methodology, so could I invite the editor to explain our methodology and how we arrive at these numbers?
Yes, we have a conservative methodology. We do a body count. We compare it against other available sources, and we come up with the best estimate. We fully accept that this may well be in many conflicts an underestimate, but we prefer to stick to our methodology. So yes, estimating direct fatalities as a result of conflict, doing body count, comparing against other available estimates and coming up with best estimate, which may well be an underestimate.
Thanks very much. There's a short note on this on page 326. Yes, thank you.
Mary Dashevsky,
Sure.
freelance journalist. You've identified a trend for states to fight back with reasonable success, recovering territory. What do you identify any reasons for this, either for the decision to do that or for the relative success?
Ben Barry.
States, particularly when they're paired with first-rank military powers, have asymmetric military advantages against asymmetric irregular actors. It cuts both ways. One of them is air power, which we've seen being used to cumulative, considerable effect in Iraq in support of the Iraqi government, and in Syria in support of the Assad government. Another one is the formidable intelligence capabilities that Western states have assembled over the 15 years since 9/11. And the other one is that Western military advisors are steeped in modern combined arms land warfare and joint air-land operations. And those are both powerful tools that can be brought both ways. Now, it doesn't all go the state's way. For example, ISIS have their own variant of conventional combined arms warfare with several irregular twists, such as suicide armoured engineers. But there's no doubt that over the long term, when the power of a modern state is brought to bear, it does offer considerable asymmetric advantage over irregular actors.
Thanks. You have a second crack.
Thank you. Ali Bahajub, North-South Publications. Given the fact that the US and its allies in Iraq have the advantage of technological and military capabilities, I'm actually puzzled that you can identify somebody from 7,000 miles and send a drone to kill them on the spot and not able to destroy ISIS in the same way?
Right. Well, maybe Ben
Thank
Barry
you.
first on the military element, and Heba, if you want to add to Ben. Sorry.
Well, after the long and problematic wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it would be extremely difficult for a Western government to send substantial land forces. So they're relying on local land forces, which in many respects they're having to help rebuild themselves whilst they're fighting. And the political dynamics in Iraq, Syria, not to mention, say, Libya and northern Nigeria, are really quite difficult for Western forces to influence. And although I explained the advantages that Western forces have in intelligence gathering, they've still only got a finite amount of it. They've only got so many drones, so many intelligence aircraft, and, or for that matter, so many people in their intelligence agencies.
Heba?
Sure. It goes back to what Professor Freedman was talking about the real problem also being very much rooted in politics. If you don't have Sunni inclusion, for example, in the government, it's still going to be a serious issue for any kind of future tackling of the Islamic State. The military solutions can only go so far. But with the increasing marginalizations of which you still see, the increasing marginalization of the Sunni population, I think the military solution is not going to be a very long-lasting one. And you continue to see this with groups like the Popular Mobilization Units, the Hashd al-Sha'bi. They continue still to be quite strong and challenge the government in a way, I think, that many Sunni Iraqis feel very alienated.
Thank you very much indeed. The book is available for everybody who's come this morning. We're very grateful for your interest, and I hope that you spent some time looking at the very detailed essays, but also assessments of all the armed conflicts around the world. Thank you very much.